Hi, my name is Laura, and welcome to my podcast, Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations, and through these discussions, you will hear why 9 times out of 10, the book wins. I'll also share different behind-the-scenes trivia I've discovered in my research, which by learning makes the story all the more interesting. If you love either books, movies, or both, this is the perfect podcast for you. This probably already goes without saying, but there will be spoilers for both the book and the movie in this podcast. So if you plan on reading the book or watching the movie, go do that first, and then come back and listen to this. And now, without further ado, let's get right into it. Hi, thanks for tuning in today. I'm really excited to talk about today's topic because out of the different book and movies I've covered, this has definitely become one of my favorites. So the book is called Another Bullshit Night in Suck City by Nick Flynn, and it was published in 2004. And then the movie is titled Being Flynn. It was directed by Paul Weitz and was released in 2012. And then I will also be talking about the book The Reenactments, which is another memoir by Nick Flynn, published in 2013. So a brief synopsis. The book is a memoir about Nick's life, and interwoven into Nick's own life is the story of his father, Jonathan, and what led both of them to a homeless shelter. Nick had been working there, and then one night his dad comes in for a bed. And this starts a relationship between the two of them. And then Nick also shares the story of him getting sober and just trying to come to terms with his childhood and the events he's experienced. So my thoughts on the book. This book combines two topics I find really interesting. Addiction, both being an addict yourself, plus having a relationship with someone who is an addict of some kind, and not knowing one or both of your birth parents. These both tend to be heavier topics, but they can be so interesting to read about in the psychological sense, as well as making for compelling stories. And they're both topics that I can relate to in some ways, so I'm sure that's also why I find them interesting to read about. And just because I find it interesting to read about, I don't want to make it seem like I'm making light of either of those, because obviously they're a serious thing. And I didn't realize that I'd like learning about people who don't know one or both of their birth parents till a couple months ago. I noticed, just coincidentally, it kept coming up in TV shows and movies and books I was reading. It just really got me thinking about it more. And even this book, it was just a coincidence. I didn't seek it out because it had to do with a guy who didn't know his dad. I actually picked it out just because I wanted to cover a movie with Paul Dano. Anyway, I really enjoyed this book and its writing style. Nick Flynn's first published work, plus he's published a lot, but he's published a lot of poems. And here he writes very poetically. He has various relationships with interesting people, and he really brings them to life with his writing. His mother, his father, the various father figures he had in his life, his friends, his father's friends, etc. And along with addiction and having an estranged parent, this book also deals with suicide and being homeless. So there's a lot of intense topics here. There's a section where he's talking about what it must have been like to have lived hundreds of years ago when if you had an alcoholic father, he would have been considered the village drunk or the village idiot. Even though Nick is describing what it would have been like back then, it's still the same emotions and situations he himself was dealing with in regards to his father, especially when they were both at the shelter. He goes into not just the emotions of the child, but also how others look on you based on the actions of the alcoholic parent. So it reads, "They would look into your eyes to see if they were his eyes. They would notice if you were to stumble slightly as you stepped into a shop. They would remember that your father too had started with a promise like you. They would know that he was a burden. They could read the struggle in your face. They would watch as you passed and nod, knowing that around the next corner your father had fallen and pissed himself. They would watch you watch him. Note the days you simply kept walking as if you didn't see. Note the days you knelt beside him, tried to get him to rise, to prop him up. If they were friends and they came by your house, they couldn't help but notice whether you had an extra room, or whether your own situation seems precarious and marginal. And they might not say anything, but they would take it all in and wonder, because either way it meant something. If this was 200 years ago, you left the village maybe once a month to bring whatever it was you grew or fabricated, onions or oil, wine or cloth, to a distant market to sell, only to return in a day or two to the village. And you might get a sense, perhaps rightly, that there was nowhere else on earth for you to be, that to leave the village would be akin to banishment, to enter into a lifetime of wandering, to become open to speculation that you'd abandoned your father to his fate, turned your back, left him to die, taken and not given back. For if you are not responsible for your own father, who is? Who is going to pick him up off the ground if not you? And then there's another brief line in regards to having a relationship with an addict, which reads, "And though he knew it was only the whiskey talking, he also knew that the whiskey talked daily." And I highlighted a lot when I read both this and the reenactments. So throughout this podcast, I'll be sharing a lot of different quotes from both of those books. Speaking of the reenactments, so in 2013, Flynn published a second memoir about what it was like to turn Suck City into a movie. After having read Suck City and then watching Being Flynn, ending with the reenactments was just the perfect way to end with the three of those. Flynn was an integral part in making this into a movie, and he was there every day it was filmed. The reenactments gives interesting insight into the making of the movie, and also talks about the deeper aspects of experiencing traumas and then seeing those traumas reenacted, and just about memories in the brain, and it was really interesting. He and director Paul Weitz, who Paul Weitz is known for directing the American Pie movies, so definitely a totally different route with this one, but he does a great job. Anyway, he and director Paul Weitz went to Boston to see the shelter and other places that Flynn had written about, as well as, of course, visiting his father. So, and there's a part where they're telling Jonathan that they're making a movie, and it reads, "It will be about your life," I tell him. My father seemingly is not greatly impressed. He's always expected a movie to be made of his life. His life is fascinating. He's trying to tell us about it right now. And then years later, when they've cast DeNiro as Jonathan, DeNiro, Weitz, and Flynn go visit Jonathan together. By this time, though, Jonathan has changed a lot since the days of Suck City, and he writes, "I warned them that my father is much diminished, that he is not the same man as the man DeNiro will be portraying. The menace is gone. He's grown old, lost his fight, toothless now." So it was interesting to read the reenactments, which was published 10 years after Suck City, and just seeing how much his dad has changed in that time. And so onto the movie. When turning this into a movie, they knew they would have to change the name of the title because they couldn't have a swear word in it. And so they went through a few different ideas, including Another Night or Welcome to Suck City, which that one in particular test audiences did not like. And ultimately they had to stray from the book title entirely, and they named it Being Flynn. The title of the book is a phrase his father says in the book, and it definitely grabs your attention. I think Being Flynn is a fine title for the movie. It might not be as grabbing, but I do think it's fitting because Nick struggles with his identity, and Jonathan will say how Nick is part of him. And so it's about struggling to accept who you are and where and who you come from. And there's also a line in the book that talks about their last name, saying, "The name Flynn comes from the Irish word flan, which translated roughly as ruddy or red-faced. The name Flynn, it seems, derives from a general term for a commoner, a bog dweller, those distinctly outside the castle walls, more akin to, 'Hey you,' than 'my good lord.'" And Paul Weitz approached Flynn to turn this into a movie back when the book first came out, and they worked on it for several years before it became a reality. The book covers heavy topics, as I said, and it can feel heavy at times, but the movie, I think, almost felt even more intense in some ways. It's, like I've said before, I think just getting that visual, which Flynn writes really well, so you can visualize it in your mind. But still, when you're actually seeing it in front of you, there's something about that. And the movie felt very artistic to me, which is fitting because the book is also just really beautiful and artistically done. And there is a line between movies being over the top emotional and being powerful. This movie kind of balances between the two at times, but I think it does stay on the powerful side. I hate when movies are over the top, emotional and dramatic, and especially when they're like trying to force you to cry, like manipulate you into crying. This movie has some intense scenes, and there's drama, of course, but I didn't feel like it was done simply to be intense and to manipulate the audience into a reaction. It felt authentic. I do think the last 15 minutes or so felt rushed, and I think it could have benefited from being another 15 or 20 minutes longer. So there are some scenes and some characters that are different from the book, but then when I was reading about when he and the director went to Boston and the reenactments, they spent time in the homeless shelter and with the homeless and with Jonathan. And so by reading that, you learn that these scenes may not have been in Suck City, but they were inspired by things they witnessed or people they met when he and the director had gone back together. So on to the acting. We have Paul Dano, which if you listen to my podcast on There Will Be Blood or 12 Years a Slave, you'll know that I'm a big Paul Dano fan. He's an amazing actor. And as I said, that's the whole reason I even chose this movie. And he plays Nick Flynn. Robert De Niro plays the father, Jonathan, and of course he gives an amazing performance. And the reenactments also gives you an inside look into all the work both De Niro and Dano did in preparation for their roles, and just how dedicated they are to the work and how much work they put into these roles. Olivia Thirlby plays Denise, and she was perfect in this. Her character is like kind of a hodgepodge of girls Nick had known and dated, and she said in an interview that she felt less pressure not playing someone who actually existed. And then we have Julianne Moore, who was cast as Nick's mom, Jodie Flynn, and Moore is a wonderful actress, and she's great here. So on to the changes. I'll start first with Emily/Denise. So in the book, which is real life, Nick does a year of college when he's 18. I believe he's 18. So he does a year of college, and while they're in the first semester, he meets a girl named Emily. And so they date for that first semester, but then after Christmas break, they kind of drift apart, although they're still in the same social circles. And one night at a party, he hears her telling a story about a guy who has been a longtime friend of her dad. And she's just talking about all the antics that this alcoholic gets himself into. And then Nick recognizes some of those stories, and he realizes that it's his dad she's talking about. So he pulls her aside and tells her this. They end up dating again soon after they realize this connection they have. And when Emily's parents find out she's dating Jonathan's son, they try to set them up so that they can meet, like by inviting both of them to dinner at the same time. But Nick doesn't fall for it. Which, by the way, so for those who haven't read the book or seen the movie, Jonathan left when Nick was like 6 months old. And then at some point, I don't remember how old Nick was, but he was still a kid. Jonathan started writing him letters. And so he knew his dad through these letters. And then they lived in the same town that like some of Jonathan's own parents lived and his mom's parents. And so he would hear these stories about Jonathan. And so that's why he like was able to recognize some of those stories Emily was telling. And then we'll get to it later, but even though the first time he meets his dad was, I don't know how long, but at some point before he shows up at the shelter, he briefly met his dad for like the first time ever. And the movie and book show this interaction the same. And so he meets him briefly, and then he doesn't see him again until he shows up at the shelter. Anyway, back to Emily and Denise. So he and Emily are together for 9 years. And like I said, after that first year of college, he drops out and he ends up working at the shelter. And while working there, he cheats on Emily with a coworker, which Emily finds out about, and she tells him that he needs to go to therapy if they're going to stay together. When he goes to a therapist, he's told he's an alcoholic, and funny enough, when he tells Emily he was told this, she says that it's nonsense and he drinks the same as anyone else. They do end up breaking up at some point, though, because Nick says, "She's ready to start a family. I'm ready to curl up in a ball for a few more years." So the movie does show Nick cheating on a girl he's with at the start of the movie, and then later he starts dating Denise, who is the one that gets him the job at the shelter, so they work there together. And she's the one that tells him he needs help. So in both cases, the girlfriends are telling him he needs help. But in the movie, she tells him that, he has an alcohol and drug problem and he needs to do something about it, and they break up. Even though I liked Denise in the movie, I do wish the movie would have included the Emily storyline, just because it's so fascinating that he happens to meet like the daughter of his dad's friend, like just the crazy coincidence of that. But based on what I read in the reenactments, it seems they created the Denise character, who was a mix of people Nick knew, because they couldn't risk being sued by the actual girl he dated. So with his childhood, the book, of course, goes more in depth into that. We learn more about the guys his mom dated, and we see the kind of influence they had on him. The movie showed Travis briefly, and that's the boyfriend who had fought in Vietnam, and he was a little crazy and unstable. And his mom actually in real life married him, and they were together for a few years until Travis ends up leaving them. Later, when Nick is in his later teens, she dates a guy who was dealing drugs, and Nick told his mom he wants to work for him, and so he got started trying to work his way up the organization. But he quits when he gets accepted to college. The movie doesn't show too much of his mom, aside from showing how much she worked and how much she was trying her best to be a good mom to Nick. In real life, the movie doesn't show this, but in real life, it seems she drank a fair amount. But as Nick says, like, everyone in that town drank, so it wasn't out of the usual. And even though she drank, she was still able to maintain her job and such. She was also into some illegal stuff as well, and like, cocaine and whatever. and she dated some shady guys. Also in the book, he talks about some of the houses they lived in, and they sound like they're just like these ramshackle places, whereas in the movie, the house they live in looks pretty nice. But even with her problems in real life, he also talks a lot in the book about what a good mom she was and the bond that the three of them had. And I say three of them because Nick also had an older brother whom the movie got rid of. The brother didn't play a huge part in the book, so it makes sense they didn't have him in the movie. And in the book, it says that the brother, when he was a teenager, he met with their dad, but the dad just talked about himself the whole time, and it just wasn't a good experience. And so from then on, the brother had zero interest in ever seeing him again. In the reenactments, you find out more about how Jody's suicide affected Nick. He, of course, talks about it in Suck City, but for the most part, the book seems more focused on the relationship with his dad. I would imagine that through the years, he's been able to heal from the wounds caused by his dad because he's been able to talk to him and get to know him, whereas he isn't able to get that closure from the trauma with his mom's death because she's no longer here. He talks about how he doesn't pray to God because he says, "I believe that anything I can name, anything I can understand cannot possibly help me, not with this. What is this? Everything." And this line kind of bugs me a bit because it seems prideful to think that God isn't big enough to be able to help you with your personal pains and traumas. Even something as traumatic as a suicide. And I have a family member who committed suicide, but I haven't experienced like a parent committing suicide. So I don't know, maybe it's judgmental of me to say that because I don't know what it's like to be in his shoes, but I do believe the power of God is strong enough for those things. Anyway, it is heartbreaking to hear about the suffering that's caused by suicide, and then watching Moore replay his mother's death is talked about in length in the book, and the scene, of course, in the book and movie is really sad to say the least. And in the reenactments, he says that his brother came to set on some of the days when DeNiro was shooting, and he says, "Just because he has no desire to meet our father, it does not mean he has no desire to meet Robert De Niro." But the brother can't bring himself to come to the days when Moore is filming because that wound is just still too raw. And also something that is left out of the movie is that Jonathan had a second wife with whom he had a daughter. And Nick remembers meeting her once when they were both young. And then in the reenactments, we learn that after the release of Suck City, she found him and they reconnected. So that's cool. So on to the homeless shelter. In real life, the shelter he worked at was called Pine Street, but in the movie it's called Harbor Street. And in the reenactments, Flynn says, "In the film, Pine Street will be renamed Harbor Street. A lawyer at Pine Street insisted, which I don't understand. My father is a success story. He made it off the streets alive." So it's for legal reasons that they changed the name. But as he says, he gives a good portrayal of the homeless shelter and makes it seem like a good thing. So it's interesting they didn't want their name in it. And the movie shows an accurate portrayal of working there as described in the book. However, in the movie, it seems that Nick only worked there for like a relatively short time before quitting, and then he goes to college. Whereas in real life, he was there for like 10 years. It was on and off, but he always ended up coming back. His dad shows up at Pine Street for the first time when Nick had already been working there for 3 years. In the book, he talks about how when people find out he works at a homeless shelter, they'll ask him questions about the homeless. And he says, "It becomes clear to me that I'm supposed to console those asking these questions, that they need me to say something that will make them feel better, confirm that there's nothing for them to do, that the problem is as inscrutable as Africa. Or perhaps they're afraid that homelessness seems more and more to be a fluid state, that they would prefer it to be something one is born into, like India and their untouchables. Sometimes I point out that 80% of the homeless are invisible, like the proverbial iceberg." And when Nick does quit Pine Street, he doesn't say goodbye to everyone the way the movie shows. He instead just doesn't show up at the end of summer the way he usually does. Instead, as the movie shows, he goes to college. And then after that, he becomes a teacher. And he says he's teaching like a younger age. And he says how a lot of his students are living in shelters or out of cars. In the movie, Lily Taylor plays Joy, a character from the book as well, who works at the shelter. And fun fact, in real life, Lily Taylor is married to the real Nick Flynn. So they started dating in 2004 and they got married in 2009. And they had a daughter together who was born in 2008 when Flynn was almost 50. The movie shows him having a daughter at a much younger age. And in the reenactments, Flynn says, "My father never came to hear me read my poems. I never invited him. In this scene, Dano will sit in a chair and read. At the end of this scene, which will be the end of the film, I will introduce my father to my wife and child, which I have done, and I will let my father hold his granddaughter, which he has done. The film will suggest that I figured out how to write a book and become a father in a couple years. In reality, it will take 10 years for the book to come out, and 10 more years for Mauve to appear. Which, I don't know if it's Mauve or Maeve, but that's his daughter. So yeah, in real life, he was nervous about becoming a dad because he himself didn't have any good father figures growing up, so it's understandable. And in the reenactments, he talks about his wife being in the movie, and it's in like the last chapter of the book, and it's a really beautiful chapter, and it's such a nice way to close out the end of that book. In the book and movie, to get away from seeing Jonathan in the shelter, Nick switches to working in the van, so he and another guy work from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., driving around in this van, helping the homeless that didn't make it into the shelter. Eventually, Jonathan is barred from Pine Street because he just gets too out of control. And Nick reflects, I joined the van in part to get away from my father, who had, for a couple of years at that point, been sleeping in the shelter. Outside, in the frigid night air, I felt I could finally breathe again. Within a few months, though, my father got himself barred from the shelter and ended up sleeping on the streets. I was back where I started. And so, like I said, one of the many things I like about this book is that it shows you the perspective of someone who is dealing with an active alcoholic, but also gives you the perspective of being the addict. Nick is both, and he has to find a way to come to peace with himself and his relationship with his alcoholic father. In the movie, there's a scene where Nick invites his dad to stay with him for the weekend. When Jonathan asks Nick why he had never invited him to stay before, Nick says that if you tried to help a drowning man, you might drown with him. This is a line from the book, the full version being, sometimes I'd see my father walking past my building on his way to another nowhere. I could have given him a key, offered him a piece of my floor, a futon, a bed, but I never did. If I let him inside, I would become him. The line between us would blur and my own slow-motion car wreck would speed up. The slogan on the side of a moving company truck read, Together we are going places, modified by a vandal or a disgruntled employee to read, Together we are going down. If I went to the drowning man could pull me under. I couldn't be his life raft. So in real life, Nick never invited his father to stay with him. And once Nick is sober, he reflects, I could have found him, taken his hand, led him home. Instead, I locked my door, got high, slept until the sun entered me again. The Zen master says that we are adrift in a river of forgetfulness, which still some days doesn't sound like the worst place to be. In the reenactments, he reflects about how he felt towards his father then versus now, and writes, By the time I made it to my mid-30s, my father had lost some of his bite. He'd become someone who genuinely needed my help or else he would go under. We will all go under one day, I know, but we don't have to die out on the streets. By the time I was 35, I was able to offer him my hand at times. But when I was still in my 20s, my father could destroy me. At least this is how it appeared. Paul Wheats explained that it was necessary to have those scenes between the two of them in Nick's apartment and outside the apartment when he had invited him in, because it's what the audience needs and it provides, a sense of closure in some ways. And it also gives the audience a chance to hear about the guilt Nick feels about his mother's death because of the unfinished story he had written and she found. So he had started writing a story about a woman who works all the time, and the story was about his mom, but she read it before he was able to finish it by saying how much the son loved the mom and knew how hard she was trying. Speaking of Nick's writing, in the movie there is a scene where Denise comes across a notebook of Nick's and she reads a poem of his. And what she reads in the movie is straight from the book. So the book has a chapter that's a few pages long, and it's just listing different phrases used for drinking and drugs. And so an excerpt from this section reads, Take the edge off, I say. That's better, I say. Loaded, I say. Wasted, looped, lit. Off my ass, befuddled, reeling, tanked, punch drunk, mean drunk, maintenance drunk, sloppy drunk, happy drunk, weepy drunk, blind drunk, dead drunk. Serious drinker, hard drinker, lush, drink like a fish, boozer, boozehound, absorb, rummy, alky, sponge, sip, sop, then muddled, then maudlin, then woozy, then clouded. What day is it? Do you know me? Have you seen me? When did I start? Did I ever stop? Slurring, reeling, staggering, overserved, they say, drunk as a skunk, they say, falling down drunk, crawling down drunk, drunk and disorderly. I say high tolerance, I say high capacity, I say social lubricant. They say productive custody. Sozzled, soused, slooshed, sozzled, sauced, sloshed, polluted, blitzed, shattered, zonked, ossified, annihilated, fossilized, stinko, blotto, legless, smashed. And it just goes on and on like that. And I really like that section of the book. It just, like that, I guess it would be considered a poem. I don't know, but it just flows really well. And it makes you realize how many terms and phrases we have for drinking. And it also shows the obsession of the alcoholic and the addict. And that section is a good example of the unique writing style Flynn has throughout this book. There's another part where Jonathan tells him that he is dressing up as Santa for the Salvation Army, and he'll be one of those guys with the buckets that rings the bell for the donations. And Nick says how he sees those Santas all the time, and now he wonders which one he passes could be his dad. It then cuts to a section where it's a play involving 5 Santas and a Dunkin' Donuts, and so it's kind of random, but I enjoyed it. In the book, he often mentions how Jonathan never asks how Nick, is doing and only talks about himself. And Jonathan was just full of self-delusions and trying to convince others of these delusions. After Nick leaves the shelter, he will go visit his dad with a video camera and record his father during their discussions. He also brings his video camera when tracking down 10 men his mother dated, and he'll interview them. And he will ask these guys just 2 questions. 1, how did you meet Jody? And 2, how did you find out about her death? And just from those 2 questions, it opens up a lot from these men, including his dad. But in the book, Jonathan tells Nick that he thinks the reason Jody killed herself was because she hated herself. And in the book, it reads, Scotty, Jonathan's buddy from Portsmouth, had a similar insight, though it was about my father. I always felt your father didn't like himself a lot, that he had a self-destructive side wider than most, that he carried around a sense of failure. You kids were an important part of his life. He would read to me the letters he wrote to you. Yet it always seemed like he was punishing himself for his failures as a father. Eventually, he made a business of being a failure. If he was close to success, he would sabotage it. The one rule he held on to was that of being a great undiscovered writer. It allowed him to lash out in anger. It became his job to straighten the world out, to point to exactly how he'd been mistreated. The art world would allow him to get away with extravagant and excessive behavior. It encouraged it. His life became a raging performance piece, scripted by Jonathan Flynn. This allowed him to stay in control of something in his life. It became all presentation. I think the movie did make Jonathan somewhat more likable, like just a bit, because there seemed to be more scenes where they're able to have a fairly normal conversation and bond a bit. Though in both, he stays delusional, basically like all the way through. Though getting off the streets and moving into an apartment certainly helped, because being homeless, doesn't help with your mental stability. And after he moves into the apartment, Nick will try and avoid visiting him the first 15 days of the month. His dad gets his disability check on the first, and then the following 2 weeks he drinks more since he has more money. And as the weeks go on, he has less money and therefore can't spend as much on alcohol. And speaking of his apartment, in the book it talks about how cluttered his apartment was, and it had this wet dog smell. When Nick is visiting him, Jonathan tells him that a friend from the streets has stayed the night not so long ago. And the book goes on. It's a form of generosity that my father invites a street person, a friend, up for the night. He even offered it to me or my brother anytime we need a place, something I never offered him when he was living on the streets. But in his room, there is no place, unless I sat upright in a straight-back chair all night, or stretched out on the bit of floor beside his single bed in the path to the bathroom, or, the horror, crawled in bed with him. I would first sleep on a bench or under a bush. I would risk rats and mayhem before I would spend a night in his room. A bit later, he introduces Paul Weitz to Jonathan, and they're in Jonathan's cluttered apartment, which, is a mess, and Nick writes of the experience. This is the way it always is. This is what I imagine Paul wants to see, though it seems even sadder, even shabbier with him here. Am I really simply letting my father live out his life like this? Do I have a choice? And so this line kind of made me think back to that quote about living back in the day with your dad as the town drunk, and just the responsibility you feel for them and the way you worry others judge you for what you do or don't do to help. In the reenactments, we learn that Jonathan is moved from his apartment to a senior living facility where he is sober for the first time since he's been in prison. He is losing his memory, though, and Nick has to remind him of things repeatedly. When the movie is on DVD, he takes it to the senior living place to watch with his dad. And throughout the movie, he has to remind Jonathan that they're watching actors play themselves. And then the scene where DeNiro, Jonathan, shows up at Pine Street for the first time, Nick says as they watch, "He works at Pine Street, I tell my father. He's upset that his father is staying there." "I would think so," my father says. "Why?" I ask. "It's a tough situation," he says. These few words are more than we have ever spoken to each other about what those days were like for him, for us. Jonathan also goes on to say how that was a hard time, being homeless, and that was something he had never admitted to before. So the book or movie, partway through this movie, I was really pulled into the story and I was ready to claim it as my new favorite movie. However, the last 15-ish minutes just felt rushed, like they just wanted to hurry and wrap it up and give the audience, the closure it was desiring. And Nick's addiction seemed to happen suddenly, and then as suddenly as he was an addict, he was getting sober. And I get they wanted his time in the homeless shelter and the relationship with his dad to be the focal point. But in real life, his addiction started when he was 13 or 14 or something. And it just got progressively worse and worse. Whereas the movie doesn't show that. I mean, at the start, they show that he's not, that he has his problems. But his addiction just starts suddenly, I thought. I do like that even though you get more closure in the movie than you do in the book, they still don't give it the Hollywood happily ever after. And the book does feel like it just kind of ends, so I get why the director would want a more solid ending. But that's why another reason I liked reading the reenactments is because you get more of an ending of sorts to Suck City in a way. But even though I have my complaints about the movie, it is still a great movie with incredible acting and directing and an amazing story, obviously. The book is one I will definitely be reading again, probably sooner rather than later. I think there's a lot to pick up on the book, and going back through a second time would be beneficial. I'll also watch the movie again at some point, but it probably won't be till further down the road. So the movie is a solid adaptation, but even so, I would still have to say that the book wins on this one. It is just such a unique, interesting, thought-provoking memoir, and it's one I could really go on and on about, but you should really just go and read it for yourself. And I know I've talked about a lot here, but as always, there's still so much more in the book and in the movie, so I highly recommend both of those. So yeah, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Join me next week next week is actually a very special episode because I will have a guest, and we are talking about yet another memoir. It is A Long Way Home by Saru Brearley, and the movie is called Lion, directed by Garth Davis, starring Dev Patel and Nicole Kidman. So that's a fun one because like I said, I have a guest on there. And it's also a memoir, which today's was also a memoir, and I'm realizing I've covered a lot of memoirs, and I have another one coming up too. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I highly recommend this book and movie, and don't forget to tune in to next week's episode. Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, head over to my site, whythebookwins.com. You can leave a comment there and I will be sure to reply. You can also find me on Instagram under the same name, Why the Book Wins, and you can message me there, and don't forget to follow. And also don't forget to subscribe to my podcast and join me next Wednesday for the newest episode of Why the Book Wins.